If you're building a challenger brand, at some point, the question of selling your business is going to cross your mind. But when should you start thinking about it? How do you prepare? And how do you make sure that you get the best deal possible without getting completely derailed in the process? Today, I'm joined by Charles Lanceley, Managing Director of Consumer Packaged Goods at Alantra, one of the leading investment banks that specialises in buying and selling consumer brands. Alantra has worked on some of the biggest deals in food and beverage. Think Fuel 10K, Strong Roots, Grenade, Ella's Kitchen, Montezuma's, you name it. So Charles is here to break down everything you need to know about selling your business, how potential buyers think, what makes a brand valuable, what are the biggest mistakes that founders make, and why focusing too much on an exit early on in your story can actually hurt your business. So whether you're planning to sell in the next few years or just want to build a brand that's worth selling, this episode is packed with insights that you won't want to miss. Let's get into it. Charles Lanceley, Managing Director in the consumer team of Alantra. How are you doing?
Good, thanks, Fee.
It's so good to have you on. So we decided we would get Alantra on because obviously Brand Growth Heroes and Alantra have got this fab partnership for the last couple of years running the Brand Growth Heroes mini MBA powered by Alantra.
It's great to be on. I've listened many times, so
thanks.
I feel slightly honoured, frankly, to be on with you.
For goodness sake. I mean, Jesus, we've shared enough meeting rooms at this point with the cohorts last year and everything. It was great fun, wasn't it?
It was great fun, actually. It was not just fun, but it was amazing to see how the cohort from last year turned up, maybe slightly cautious about what they were about to experience. And the closing session had total clarity, or if not total, a lot of clarity on where they were going to take their business for the next 3 to 6 to 12 months.
It was really good, wasn't it? It's a great feeling. Okay, so imagine I'm out there scaling my challenger brand. When do I start thinking about whether I want to sell my business at some point and how to sell my business?
Starting with, I just want to get it big and I just want to sell it, probably isn't the right way around. Because the bigger you get a business, probably the better chance you're going to have of being able to have a good exit. And you could speak to many, many founders and they'll say, it's those first few years wading through, getting through the first few 100,000 of sales to the first million, to the first couple of million. Those are hard yards. And you need to have your mind 24 hours a day on the business and growing the business rather than thinking about selling it.
How much time and energy does it take from the moment you decide that you are going to sell and that you're preparing for sale? Like, what are all the jobs to be done for a founder? How do they go about doing that?
It takes a lot of energy and it takes a lot of focus. It's not something you can do on the side if you want to do it properly, that is. Part of what we do, and as a firm, we specialize in selling businesses for people. We do other things, sure, but our main activity at Alantra in the M&A team is working for sellers. And part of what we do is in the process, and there's many, many different things involved, is try and ensure that our clients have the most efficient process run so they don't have to take their mind off the business. If you do a sales process where half your mind is suddenly taken up with thinking about how to articulate the story to buyers, preparing materials, going through hours and hours of preparations and then presentations, building data rooms, thinking about the ramifications of the legal documents, inevitably you can't focus on the business. What then often happens is businesses suffer. And then if you have a business where performance is suffering as you're going through the sale process, that's going to hinder the sale process.
Yeah.
So you want to have those two things happening. So the job of a good advisor is to make it as painless as possible for the founder by taking away all that stress so the founder or the management team can keep running the business so it keeps doing really well, and that makes everyone's job easier.
I'm going to be purposefully, obtuse here, but surely it's just you've got your pitch deck anyway, you've got your investor deck, it's a little couple of tweaks there, you have your business plan. I mean, what else is there? Spell it out to me, because I think people tend to underestimate the amount of work, but unless we spell it out for them, they're not going to know what's involved.
I think in the world of M&A, you're never out there for sale. There's no for sale sign that goes up. Being for sale is not a good thing. If someone with a business in, healthy snacks comes to us, says, I'm thinking about selling my business. So what we don't do is say, okay, cool, well, look, we'll put a for sale sign up and then we'll just see who turns up. Because in other industries, you say, here's the price tag, it's for sale. Just tell us if you're interested. You don't do it that way. The job of a good advisor is effectively to already know who the likely buyers of the business are or investors. Now, you've got broadly two buyer pools. There's trade buyers who quite often buy the whole business, or there's investors who will quite often take a stake, and that's either putting fresh capital into the business or cashing out some of the existing capital. So there's two routes you can go. So a good advisor should know, based on the sector you're in and how big you are and how well you're doing and what your focus is and where you play, here are the likely buyers for your business.
Okay.
Now, a good advisor should already be speaking to those advisors on a regular basis because they're fluent in the sector. Because part of the job of a good advisor is knowing who is active on the buy side at any moment in time. So rather than guessing or saying, well, I'd have to go out and talk to the market to see who's interested, really, we should be saying, well, we already know broadly who's going to be interested because we've had conversations with these people in the last few months about their view on the market, their appetite for M&A, and these people aren't active at the moment. These are. It's one is who's there, roughly.
Can I ask a question just on that? And
Yep.
sorry, if this puts us down a different track, then we can come back to it. But what I'd love to know is the who's there piece. How much does it help if you understand? So I know, for example, that you've worked lots with co-manufacturing and manufacturing and buying and selling businesses that have much more to them than just a brand. Is understanding their industry really important?
Yeah, it is. It's pretty fundamental. The devil is always in the detail. So, as I said, you can't just slap a sign up saying, here's this business, it's for sale. So it's not just knowing who the likely buyers are, but it's the why. Why would they be interested in buying this business?
Okay.
Now, I think in order to be able to answer that question, you need to know a lot about your buyer pool, about what they're interested in buying, about your clients or the business that you're trying to sell, to then have a better understanding as to whether those two things are going to match up. And part of that piece as well, it's not just so who the buyers, it's what's the investment story? So why would they buy you? And it could be for 100 different reasons. It could be on the supply chain side. So you've got a great manufacturing facility and you can make products that are really hard to make. And actually this buyer wants to get into this space. It doesn't have any capabilities in this area and they're really keen to, and they're just about to spend £20 million buying a factory. So actually, not only are they going to solve that problem and a 2-year time lag on building a factory, they get to buy your business and then maybe they get your brand with it.
Okay.
So it's those kind of things. So you got to understand what are the criteria of the business that are going to interest the buyers. And it could be any number of things. So it could be the team and the team's specialism. It could be a brand that they don't have.
IP
in the business, exactly. So you've got protection around developing a certain product that they then can't do unless they buy you, and therefore the IP. It could be
access to markets. So, for example, if you were already in France and they were like, woohoo, we could put all our products into those relationships.
Access to markets or access to a specific channel. So they could play in the grocery channel, but have no access to food service, which takes a different skill set, a different team.
It certainly does.
Because you're going to go through that angle. It could be D2C. So they're traditional routes to market. They don't have any capabilities in D2C, which is still a specialist area. And you need to know exactly what you're doing.
I'm thrilled to introduce Brand Growth Hero's newest partner, Jolson. Jolson is a leading B Corp certified commercial law firm that specialises in guiding the founders of scaling CPG brands. With long-term relationships with clients like Little Moons, Trip, Eat Natural, Bear, Graze and Pulson, Jolson is also famous for advising the Innocent founders in their landmark sale to Coca-Cola. And believe it or not, they still work with the Innocent founders at Jam Jar Investments today. I'm especially impressed by how Jolson sets founders up for long-term success and by their commitment to championing female founders. Recently, I asked one of Jolson's managing partners, Paul Chappie, a tough but crucial question. Should co-founders discuss, right from the start, What happens if one of them wants to leave the business?
Absolutely. I mean, with any joint venture, that's what a sort of co-founder relationship is. You've got to be very clear from the outset as to what each party is bringing to that business. Look at the skill sets, look at the time commitment. I often see founders coming where, one founder might have a full-time job. They're still getting the same amount of equity. And you can see immediately that there's an imbalance in that relationship that they either haven't looked at or are ignoring. And eventually that will come home to roost. So I think the key thing is to look at, what are we bringing? What is that future going to bring? What are the things that, if I have to go and look after kids or have to emigrate somewhere, what's going to happen to this business? What happens to my equity? All those questions need to be thought through, discussed, and contractually you can then just draft those provisions into that contract and set that relationship on a firm footing.
Huge thanks to Brand Growth Heroes podcast sponsors Jolson. Now let's get back to the show. Out there right now, what are the hot things that buyers are looking for to kind of, what boxes are they looking to tick? Is it the same as always, or does it come in cycles?
Comes in cycles for sure. I think after COVID, there was a period of time where virtually every trade buyer that we spoke to was convinced that they had to be in D2C because the channels had shifted so heavily from traditional, multiple retail, food service, towards D2C. And I think everyone assumed that that was then the way it was forevermore. Everyone looked at the world and said, we don't have a D2C, we're missing a key leg, it's going to be maybe 20% of the whole market, so we've got to be in there. It didn't take that long, actually, for that view to unwind. You had a lot of these D2C businesses who'd started, gone from 0 to 20 million of sales almost overnight, and then had flatlined because they'd assumed that their onboarding of consumers online and their purchase patterns and the way consumers buy was always therefore going to be online. But obviously shops started opening up again. People decided they didn't want to spend so much time, in front of a screen or interacting online, and people wanted to head back in store. So then what we saw is actually a bit of a reversal, whereby a lot of the buyers were saying, I'd quite like an omni-channel. So you've got to be balanced. I don't just want to see D2C only. And actually, more recently, we've seen a bit of an unwinding. So this is moving back towards traditional retailing, with buyers saying, I don't really want to be in D2C now, because what I can see is that purchase patterns have almost reverted towards pre-COVID levels.
Wow.
So it changes. What are people really interested in now? I think it totally depends on buyer and sector. And as I kind of said with the example of a buyer that's looking at a business and they don't have a facility, and so they want that. It really genuinely depends on the specifics of the buyer, and it's why a good advisor is capable of articulating the right story, and that story might even be different to different buyers. As an advisor, know this about your business. This specific piece will attract this buyer. This specific piece will attract this buyer. So let's not go out with a blanket message of it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are the top selling points. I'm going to focus on 3 for this buyer because this is what's going to get them hooked, and 1 for this buyer.
It's exactly like we would have a tailored presentation to Ocado versus to Holland & Barrett versus to Asda. We would be turning up the volume on certain benefits, and yeah, okay, I get it.
I just think the other thing as well is, so what makes a good advisor? It's knowing who the buyers are, it's knowing what they want, and I think it's 3, being able to articulate that clearly to the buyers, and then I think it's also knowing what the value is. We'd be able to say to people, look, we think your business is worth somewhere between X and Y. You can never be 100% accurate, but I think it's that understanding that it is a bit of a skill.
It's a dark art.
It is a bit of a dark art. It's definitely also impacted by the fact that the value is in the eye of the beholder. So your business standalone could be worth roughly X because you've grown at a certain rate. you've got this level of profitability, you've got a brand awareness level of here, and then good repeat rate, recommendation rate, and you've got a really compelling business plan. Just a few of the kind of many criteria. And so, we look at the businesses that have had similar characteristics in the past, and these businesses have achieved between an X and Y of a multiple on their sales or a multiple on their EBITDA. And if we take those same multiples and apply them to your business, then you might be worth about here. I think that's fine. That's a bit plain vanilla. What you've really got to do is be able to understand a buyer is going to look at your business and say, yeah, but look, we've got this huge distribution network. You've got a brand here that we couldn't create overnight. In fact, we couldn't create because we would just ruin it. And so what we think is if we take your brand and plug it straight into our international distribution or straight into another channel, or frankly, just put our huge sales team behind your brand that has massive consumer loyalty, then we think we're going to be able to, within 12 months, turn this on and generate 20 million of extra sales. To us, that's hugely valuable. So I think part of the skill set is, again, being able to say, look, you're probably worth this on a standalone. We think the buyer is going to have a slightly different view. Their own business plan is going to look like this, and they're probably therefore going to be able to pay a premium.
I think this is really important, though. So a really good advisory firm and the advisors in a really good advisory firm are going to have really deep relationships with potential buyers in the sector, and they're going to understand the needs of those buyers, and they're almost going to be able to preempt what that buyer might find valuable, because the value of the business may be much more than it would be if you just calculated it on basic multiples, because the value's in the eye of the beholder. I think that is such a nugget. It's a bit like, I was talking to Jolson, one of our other partners, the Brand Growth Heroes partners, about choosing the right law firm, choosing the right legal advisor. And at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to experience and data points in your brain and muscle memory and all the things that you've seen before. You're able to go, whether it's, I know that we could talk to this person, or that person would find this valuable, or have you thought about this? That really matters. The whole ecosystem, and having worked in that ecosystem, really matters, doesn't it? It's not just a question of understanding your own industry, it's understanding your clients' industries. And I suppose I didn't really appreciate that before. I thought investment banks just needed to be good at investment banking. A bit naive on my part.
But I guess the way to look at it is, let's say you went for an operation, you want a specialist in that area. You don't want a physio doing brain surgery.
No.
So it's the same. People who are hiring advisors should be thinking about getting the specialists in that area. Now, if there are business owners out there listening and an advisor was saying, look, I'm not really sure who's going to buy the business, but look, we'll quickly knock up a teaser, which is a few pages of information, and we'll just send it out to 150 people and see what comes back. Alarm bells should be ringing.
Okay.
You want your information out there with 150 people that's just generic with no kind of context to it, because suddenly you're for sale. And if you don't then execute a deal and you then want to go again in 12 months' time because you didn't get it right first time, you're going to go out to maybe a more targeted group, but they'll look at the materials. They'll say, I got an email about this 12 months ago. It was really vague, but you said you were going to do X million of sales. You haven't done that. And actually also you didn't sell. So was there something wrong?
Okay. So actually you have to be really careful about how you handle this. You have to be really, really careful. So that would be one of the mistakes. What other big mistakes do people make on this journey from early days onwards?
Great question. Look, I think there's a few really obvious mistakes. One is not being prepared enough for the process.
In what way?
They're hard work. And if you have lots of interest in your business, usually the right thing to do is to maintain that broad interest for as long as possible. So you don't isolate one buyer early and say, we'll go with you, because then you lose competitive tension. You keep running with as many buyers as you can for as long as you can.
Dating lots of people at the same time.
Yeah. So they can do their diligence on your business and ultimately get to a point where you have more than one party who is saying, I've done all my diligence on the business. I checked everything. And your business ticks the boxes. It is what I thought it was. There's no skeletons in the closet. It's good. Then you come to the legals, where you've got to speak to someone like Jolson to get to a position where there's nothing that's a risk area for you in terms of the legal documentation you need to enter into a deal and a contract. Yeah, and it's the transaction documents, for example, the sale and purchase agreement, where it's establishing the terms
Right.
around the transaction. It's protecting you as a seller from things like warranties and a buyer being able to bring warranty claims against you. So if you get to the stage where you've got multiple parties who've done the diligence and effectively saying, we're done, we're ready, the documents are there, so there's, you know what you're signing up to, effectively it can then come down to two things: price, who's going to put more money on the table, and who you like best, if that counts for you. If you're the kind of individual who puts value on one party over another because this party is more aligned with my culture and my values, that's what you ultimately want, because that's when it comes down to a race against those things. If you've got one party and then you've given them an exclusivity for several weeks, again, other parties will know this. So you've given someone exclusivity, suddenly there's no deal, you go back to the second party, oh, we come back to you, do you want to do a deal? Well, what happened to the first party? Did they find something that they didn't like in the business? Is that why they dropped away? So doing the preparation early gives you the ability to manage multiple people in the process, if that's what you want to do, which is hard work. Because if you think about this, what you're going to do is put yourself in the shoes of a buyer. If you're putting a lot of money down, you want to know exactly what you're getting into. And you can't just read a 50-page document, 100-page document and say, I know. It's going to require multiple meetings, questions and answers over the course of several weeks. Sometimes these are 500 questions per buyer.
Oh my God.
Sometimes 1,000. And if you've got 3 or 4 buyers asking 1,000 questions over the space of 4 weeks, that is a lot of time and effort going into it.
So is that what you and your team would do?
We manage that process. We triage. So questions come in, and rather than just saying, here you go, there's all these questions, it's probably one of the more minor parts of our job, but definitely an important one, is triaging. So we say, you've already asked this question, but one of your other advisors has asked this question, don't duplicate, please. Or we know the answer, so we draft the answer, and then the buyer just needs, our client, the seller, just needs to give the approval that answer is right. That takes the weight off their shoulders. So we do the triage and we manage that process. So we effectively, we're divvying out the questions to the right people.
God, that is a lot of work.
But it's a lot of work, and if you're not prepared for that, and you get asked a question that actually you don't know the answer, and it's really hard, and you've got to go in and spend 3 days to answer it. The finance function has to answer that question. And in the meantime, you've got more questions flooding in. You're suddenly underwater and it's hard to get back. So if you're prepped and ready, you answer the questions easily, you keep momentum going. If buyers are waiting 3 days, 4 days for an answer, it really puts the brakes on momentum. It's not helpful. So being prepared properly is critical. It gives you the ability to upfront to articulate the right story, and then find out, well, maybe your story is not great, and then how do we preemptively solve that problem? So you need to be able to do that, and then it gives you the ability to know, okay, we know this answer because we've already done the work, so we can stay on top of things.
You got another one for me?
Another one is putting all your eggs in one basket.
Or this is the mistakes now?
Now, it's still on the mistakes, and I'll stop at these two because there are many, many more, but thinking this is the buyer for sure, they're going to buy the business. We've been talking to them for a few years. They told us they love it, and we think it's them. So look, let's just try and deal with them. Quite often that turns out to be a case where you go down the line with them, you invest lots into getting them up the curve, doing all the work, and then they'll drop out at the last moment.
Just like a house sale.
A house sale. You get burned by that. And then you don't want to go and talk to other buyers. And even if there are other buyers there, it's tough to come back from that kind of process. So I think taking a step back and thinking, okay, I think this party is they're really good buyers, so we'll go with them, is what am I trying to achieve here? Am I genuinely trying to achieve a transaction only with this party, or am I trying to exit? In which case, are there other people who we should go and speak to? Or is there a way in which we can manage that process to avoid 2 to 3 months of work and then a massive disappointment?
Okay, wow. It's a lot more work and a lot more thinking and a lot more chess pieces than I had imagined. I know you can't always, be really transparent with all of the deals that you've done because of confidentiality and all of that. But like, have you got any examples of, even if you can't say the businesses' names, of where something got a really big multiple over and above what it might have got because of the fact that the value was in the eye of the beholder, like you said earlier on? Because that's just such an insight.
Multiples are always ebbing and flowing. There are short-term cycles, which is, and this is in terms of the public markets, where company market capitalizations are volatile, they go up and down, and that affects the multiples that the public companies are trading at. And then there's longer term shifts where that's more down to the underlying market trends. But you tend to have an upper and a lower range always. In some way, you're between the two. And they also vary by country. So the UK and the US, for example, or Europe and the US, there's always a differential because there's different dynamics there and totally different businesses. And we're going through different phases as well. Where are we at the moment? The market if I talk purely to UK food and bev, we've been through a period of time where multiples have been a bit depressed. And that's partly because there's just been very limited activity. Buyers standing off. I think sellers potentially having too high value expectations, so deals not getting done.
So some correction happening, really.
Been a bit of a correction, yeah. And I think there's probably been some deals that have had to happen because sellers have maybe been forced. So multiples there have therefore been a bit depressed. And then on the other side of things, there's still good businesses will always get good valuations, regardless of where you are in the cycle. But I think if you look back over the last couple of years, interest levels have been a bit subdued. So it's not been a great environment for looking at valuation metrics. I think also the private equity players in the market have been notably absent.
Is it true that people have been moving away from food and bev because, as in buyers or investors moving away from food and bev because they're like, the profitability just isn't there. It's really, we now understand that it's a really difficult market. We don't get the same returns that we would for tech. Is that true?
It is true. Yeah. You got to remember that a lot of private equity investors are generalists. So they can put their money in a number of different sectors. If you go back a couple of years, certainly the backdrop to the food and beverage world was raw material pricing is massively volatile. There's huge inflation. How would I know as an investor that you as a business are going to be able to pass on that inflation to your customers or the consumers? And if you can you do it immediately? Or is there going to be a lag, which therefore we'll see in the P&L because you've got a higher price of your goods coming in?
God, that's really interesting. Do you know, I've never thought of that before, that you would actually have such a bird's eye view that you'd be thinking, inflation is going to happen whether you like it or not. Are you going to be able to pass on that inflation?
Yeah. And lots of businesses will secure pricing for a few months. So they'll say, well, we've secured price X with these suppliers. So that gives us cover for a few months. But in that period, the market price of a commodity that you might be buying could have doubled, which it has done. If Whey 90, for example, which is a traded commodity, the price over the last few years has doubled and then halved and then doubled. It's extremely volatile. So you might look as a buyer and think, I don't know if you can pass that on. Actually, your customers might say no. So you're going to have a margin hit. What's that going to do to your P&L? And when can you cut the costs? Or can you engineer your product? Or how are you going to manage it? And actually, lots of businesses haven't been able to answer those questions sufficiently. And I think from an investor point of view, they've therefore said, well, okay, in this world, there's probably an element of discretionary purchase behavior from the consumer. They don't have to buy this. And I don't have to invest my money here. My fund allows me to invest my money in these other sectors like business services or tech. And I think that's much more protected. So I'll invest there. So actually, a lot of private equity firms have chosen not to invest in food and bev.
That all sounds very depressing. Is it changing? Is it coming back up? Is it recorrecting? What's the upside now?
It is changing. It's coming back. I think there was a period of time where the backdrop wasn't great in the food and bev space in terms of exactly those things. So perceived, belt tightening from the consumer. So interest rates going up, mortgages becoming more expensive.
Oh, we're all living it. I mean, we're both living it as parents. Jesus, it's desperate, isn't it?
It is. Look, what tends to happen is actually people, I think, get more used to the status quo.
Yeah.
Not actually in a very different place than we were a couple of years ago. If you think about the new news, well, there's a war. There's a war in Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine. So what's going to happen here? Interest rates are really high. Inflation's high. We've got two wars going on not that far away from us. Interest rates are still high. Costs are going up. So it's not that actually everything's fine. I actually think that it's just that people get used to what the status quo is, and they just become. It's less of an uncertainty.
It's the creep of new normal, isn't it?
Going into the US market is and has for a long time been the bright lights for so many UK brands, and probably wrongly so. There's so many businesses that are still scratching the surface in the UK, and immediately they think about the US. But if we go to the US, here's what we could do. And but you're only trading in Waitrose and Sainsbury's. So what about the rest of the UK? You've only got into 400 stores there for two products.
Right.
There's a mountain to climb. Focus. So actually, look, maybe it'll be a deterrent if there are tariffs, but maybe a good one. Because I think it's international is a distraction for a lot of business owners in the early days.
Okay.
Because it's about getting on shelf and then selling off shelf.
Yeah.
You can't just get on shelf and leave it there and think you've done the job. You get on shelf, you've got to make sure that the consumer at the shelf, standing looking at the shelf, pulls you off shelf.
That's the hard bit.
If you don't get that, you'll get delisted, and then you'll find it hard to get another listing. So it's getting on shelf and making sure that you exceed your target rates of sale. Otherwise, your buyer will not be happy.
I think as well, to build on that, year 2.5 is the really hard one, because that's when the buyers sit you down and go, well, it was great and you were really giving us a point of difference and you were one of the first into this new segment in the category. But now we're 18 months or we're 20 months, 24 months in, and the rate of sale has slowed, or it isn't as high as we thought it was, and we're reducing space. What can you do? And that's where they stop being your mate and they start negotiating with you. And that can be such a wake-up call to founders of challenger brands. And it's really difficult, because that's when you really have to have some margin to be able to spend on whether it's field sales or merchandising or local marketing kind of hub activity, where you say, right, around these cities and these stores, we're going to activate the brand and the trial by spending some money, But with the squeeze on margins, it's really difficult in food and bev to make that happen. And I think that's the one thing I would say to anyone starting out in a food and bev business at the moment is, unless you're sure that you can have 40% gross margin within 2 or 3 years time, unless there's a route to making that happen, you have to be really careful and think really hard about starting the business at all. I really do think that, because so many businesses out there are struggling purely because the founders haven't lent into that truth, because it is a truth. It isn't just something that people say to depress you. It is just a truth.
I think for a while now, people have shoved their head in the sand on the importance of gross margin or gross profit. And there's a lot of different ways to look at it. And so people either don't look at their P&L in the right way, either they including cost items in the wrong place, which allows them to think they're doing better than they are, or they just don't even think about it because the view is ultimately it'll be fine if we just keep growing. Sales growth, that's the all important. It's not. And I think in a time, especially if we think about the just pre-COVID era, there was a lot of easy money for disruptors, challenger brands in the food and beverage space. And I think that was a safety blanket.
It's not there anymore, is it?
It's gone.
Can I just ask you a question? Because people always say there's so much money out there. I mean, there's institutions with billions. There's so much money. There's so much money. The money's out there. Just, knock on the door. Is that true, or is that just a total generalization that doesn't apply in the case where the structure in the industry is that gross margin is really hard to find right now when commodity prices are high? Like, which way should we be looking at it as a founder? Should I be thinking, no, the money's out there, you've just got to knock on the right doors? Or should I be going, actually, the money's only out there for certain sectors, certain categories, certain gross margin structures?
Certainly, if you want the best investors, which people should seek to get the best investors they can get, i.e. the ones that can add lots of value, they will all be extremely knowledgeable about what your business should be. And that includes having a very good margin. I don't subscribe to the view that the money's out there, you've just got to find it. Because actually, even in the era when there were loads of investors putting money into businesses, these aren't people sitting there who suddenly your pitch deck lands and they say, wow, this looks interesting. In any given day, they're probably receiving 10 or 20. You're looking at this wide selection. You've got a menu of things to put your money into, and you've got to stand out. And so unless you're ticking the boxes, again, you're going to fall down into the no cap. It's a difficult job being a higher volume investor, putting money into startup food and beverage companies.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's not happening now because, there's not that volume of activities going on. There's fewer opportunities for investors to put their money behind, and therefore the bar's gone higher. So those investors, they're not looking at 20, it's 2 or 3, but they want to make sure that they're very, very high quality. So focusing on margins is really important. We advised a corporate year before last that this deal ticked virtually every box except for margin and stability of the gross margin. And we couldn't get comfortable that it was there. And so the deal didn't happen. And actually it came back because I think that was a bit of an eye-opener for the business. And they did some great work in terms of their supply chain and boosting margins to get the business, irrespective of any kind of buyer interest, into a much, much stronger place. And I think they would have held their hands up and said that's something they'd not really done before. But they then turned their attention to it and did it really well. And as a result, that whole deal came back together. But it was really, that was one of the major points that fell down. So it's an example where you can't just say, well, we've got a brand that people want, so nothing else matters.
Talk to us about some of the deals you've done then.
Well, okay. So if I go back over the years, what are some of the deals that I've been particularly proud of, or that I've found particularly interesting?
Yeah.
So in more recent years, I would say selling, for example, a stake in Strong Roots for Sam Denigan,
Yeah.
US private equity, selling Montezuma's chocolates for the founders, doing the buy side for Fuel 10K.
Cool. Do you know that that's one of our most downloaded episodes ever? That episode on what was it like to sell Fuel 10K to Premier Foods, which is really interesting that people are so interested in hearing
That's
about that.
also by far my most viewed LinkedIn announcement.
Is it?
That announcement got something like 27,000 views.
Wow.
Which is far more than they usually get.
Yeah.
And then going back a bit further into the past, so selling Natural Balance Foods, which is Naked and Trek, doing the buy side for Grenade, acting on the sell side for Ella's Kitchen.
Wow. You've got some super.
So lots of disruptors and brands have gone on to, to be real stars in the industry.
And more recently, you've been looking at stuff that's less brand specific, but more about manufacturing, right? And we've been chatting over lunch about how fascinating that was. What insights can you share with us that, will help founders deepen their understanding of what's valuable and what's not valuable?
I spend a lot of my time, especially in the food supplements space, working not necessarily with the brand owners, but with the owners of the people who are sitting in many cases behind the scenes. So the developers and the manufacturers of the products, which tend to be the vitamins, minerals, and supplements. So that's the tablets and capsules, soft gels, powders, liquids. I think that world unfairly gets a lot less attention because being a brand owner and owning a brand is seen by many as a far more interesting place to be because it's nice and shiny and you've got your product on the shelf. But also, actually, I think the barriers to entry are a lot lower. If you set up a brand and you go to a third party who can do all of this stuff for you, you just need to be the sales and marketing engine. I know, it's so easy. You don't need to do anything else. All you got to do is sell the stuff. Surely that's easy.
Throw up a website, an Instagram.
Yes.
It's easy.
There is a ginormous industry behind the scenes of people who are amazingly skilled at developing and then manufacturing products. And I've done a lot of work and completed a lot of deals in that space all across Europe for businesses that are leading in the development and manufacturing of VMS.
Have you seen their factories?
Yeah, many, many, many factories all across Europe.
But you see, I think this is really interesting for people out there to know, because if I was selling a food supplement or, any kind of capsule, powder, protein drink, whatever, I would want someone who had been around loads of factories. Like, I can't tell you, any of the listeners out there, how important it is to like walking around factories. I know it might be seem like the most boring thing in the world. But if you learn to walk around factories and love it and become a geek about it, honestly, there are so many things that you can do when you understand how factories work. It's amazing, isn't it?
It's fascinating. I like factories. I like seeing things being made.
You just like the hair nets. Come on. And those shoe covers. Who doesn't love those shoe covers?
No, it's fascinating, and it's also, I find it really useful being able to understand the full value chain. So when I speak to a branded business now in that world, I understand when they say I get my products from here, I understand that manufacturer and their capabilities,
Okay.
and also understand maybe other options for them. And I can make those recommendations. But I'll give you another example. So because my knowledge there is quite in depth also in terms of the supply chain and the unit costs, I many a time have worked on the buy side for companies where they are looking to buy a brand, and that brand has their products manufactured here. I actually can say, these are the unit economics.
They're paying too much.
I actually know 5 different options across Europe that can do this whole range, and maybe they could do it at the same quality, but maybe you could save 10 to 20% on
Wow.
the cost. So we, a few years ago, we did a project where part of our work as an advisor, and we do work on the buy side as well. We advise people looking to buy businesses and want advice on whether that's the right thing for them to buy. Part of our scope was to interrogate the entire P&L and come up with our view on, here's the P&L you're buying, here's the P&L that you could probably get to in 12 months. It looks totally different because we benchmarked the cost of goods, the IT cost, the marketing spend, absolutely everything, and then been able to say, and you could probably get to here, and here's the granularity that sits behind it. And that allowed our client to say, okay, well, look, maybe we don't bid on the business we're being shown. Maybe we bid not everything on the P&L that you're showing us, but we assume that we can get part of the way there. And that's how we can pay more and get comfortable paying more. So it looks like a really high price on what they're showing us,
Okay.
but it's not a high price on what we can do with it, which comes back around to the discussion at the beginning about knowing what the buyers can pay is different to what the intrinsic value is in the business. So I do a lot of that work in that space specifically. I guess we do it as a firm. That is also one of our USPs, is that we do a lot of detailed work on the granular stuff to really get under the skin, and whether that's from a brand perspective or whether it's from a supply chain and setting up the value chain perspective.
You were on the buy side for Fuel 10K, were you?
We were.
So you must understand that granular level of detail across a lot of food categories, because Fuel 10K has been across liquid, cereals.
They had snack cookies, snack bars.
So you'd understand all of that as well. Because it is transferable, isn't it? I can walk through a factory, having been involved in so many different categories throughout my professional career. I can walk through a factory and be able to say, okay, well, is that lid putter on a 70 millimeter or a 90 millimeter standard lid size, and how much would that machine cost to change, and does it handle glass or plastic or whatever, and is that corner of the room being used? And it doesn't really matter if it's crisps or chocolate or, I suppose, liquid capsules as well. You know that there's fillers and there's something automated or not automated. And once you have that language in your head and that kind of neural map of how it all works, you can just apply it to a new category and then use that. So yeah, it's brilliant to have that level of detail.
And I think also the other thing about is if you're in that part of the supply chain, one of the critical areas is ensuring that your customers don't want to and can't leave you because you have the best relationship with them. So for anyone that is in the CDMO world, where you're developing and manufacturing products, your business will be far more valuable if you can prove that your customer relationships are bulletproof. Because ultimately, the value in your business is partly what you're doing and what you're making, but the fact that you will retain your customers for a sustainable period of time into the future, if not indefinitely, because either they can't go anywhere else, or even if they could, they don't want to.
God.
And that's understanding those dynamics about how do you ensure that your customers are locked into you. Again, that's part of the value chain, and that's one of the critical areas of kind of articulating value.
Wow.
I suppose this conversation has been about kind of exiting largely.
Yeah.
What do we do as a firm to help exit? And I would say we come across so many founders and owners of businesses who I think spend too much time thinking about exit, when it's going to happen, who are the buyers, should we talk to them now, should we start a dialogue going, should we do all of this? It can be a massive distraction. Just try and isolate that thought, park it, and focus for as long as you can purely on your business, putting your business in the best possible shape it can be in, because that will put you in a much better position when you actually come to exit than thinking for 2 years about all these things. That's what an advisor is there to do, is to be able to say, okay, we're on board. Now, here's where we are. Here's where we're going to go. And if you get to that point in time where you've been dedicating all your energy into your business and making it as good as it can be, not thinking about, I think I'm going to sell to this person, so I'm going to invest heavily in here, in this area at the moment. You never know if that person's going to turn up. So just concentrate on the business. Don't try and build it for someone. Just build it because you trust what you're doing. You've used the insights from your business, whether it's insights into your product and what your customers want, or insight into your consumers and who they are and why they're buying and when they're buying and who they're buying for and how often and how much they recommend you as a brand, all these kind of things. Trust all of that. Put your effort to that area.
Brilliant advice. Charles Lanceley from Alantra, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's been great.
That was such an insightful conversation with Charles. There are so many things to take away there. And if you only take one thing away, let it be this. The best way to maximise your exit is to focus on building an exceptional business first. Don't waste years thinking about who might buy you. Put that energy into creating something that's impossible to ignore. If you want to learn more about Alantra and what they do, check out the links in the show notes. And if you're enjoying Brand Growth Heroes, don't forget to hit follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this useful, please share it with another founder who needs to hear it. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time on Brand Growth Heroes.